The city had been dark for 9 days. Dex Calloway knew this because he had scratched a mark into the concrete wall for each one, 9 thin lines behind the boiler housing, in the sub-basement of the Harwick Civic Center, which had been a library and a rec hall and a polling station before the lights fell from the sky and changed the meaning of the word before forever. He'd been down here when the invasion started. That was luck, or something shaped like it. He'd been 3 floors underground, rerouting conduit for a building upgrade that nobody would ever need now, and the EMP pulse that turned every car and phone and pacemaker within a half-mile into scrap had left him standing in sudden darkness with only a flashlight, a tool bag, and the faint chemical smell of the city burning above him. He'd stayed because there was nowhere else to go. He'd stayed because he'd looked out the basement grate on the first evening and seen what was happening in the street. The way the light moved when the Orathi hunted, the orange shimmer that preceded the soft, terrible sound of a human being simply ceasing to exist. Not a drawn-out scream, not an explosion. A presence, and then the absence of a presence, and the ash that floated down afterward, which might have been a person. There'd been a woman walking a dog on the corner when the first shimmer swept the block, and then there wasn't a woman or a dog, and Dex had pressed his face against the concrete wall and breathed through his nose until his hands stopped shaking. The Orathi were invisible most of the time, a distortion in the air, a heat mirage that moved with terrible purpose. You only saw them when they fed or when they swept the ground with their sensing fields, and by then you were already dead if you were standing in the open. Dex had an advantage most people didn't. He knew electricity. Not in the way people say they know things when they mean they've read about it. He knew it the way a man knows it after 30 years of pulling wire through walls and tracing fault lines in complex systems. He'd been electrocuted twice, once mildly, once not mildly, and the second time had given him an animal-level understanding of what current through living tissue actually meant. The lights in the vision, the involuntary convulsion of every muscle simultaneously, the way his heart had stuttered, and then, after a terrible suspended moment, kept going. He was not afraid of electricity. He respected it the way you respect something that will kill you if you're careless, and that respect had given him a vocabulary for what he was watching. He watched the Orathi from his grate in those first days, really watched, and he understood something in his hands before his brain caught up. They hunted bioelectric signature. Every human being radiated a faint electromagnetic field, the heart, the nervous system, the brain, the whole living system broadcasting at low frequencies, a signature as distinct as a fingerprint. The Orathi swept those frequencies the way a metal detector sweeps beach sand. Where they found a signal, they converged. He spent most of the first day sitting in the dark against the boiler housing, working through the logic. Start with what you know. What he knew, they were energy beings or close enough. They consumed bioelectric signatures. They passed through most solid structures without apparent difficulty, which suggested they weren't constrained by conventional electromagnetic interaction with matter. But they hadn't come through the sub-basement walls. They'd swept the grate and moved on. Why? He'd thought about it for a long time, turning it the way you turn a problem in the dark when you can't write anything down yet. Then he'd thought about the building itself. The sub-basement of the Harwick Civic Center had been part of a 1960s civil defense retrofit. The city had been preparing for nuclear contingency, and the sub-basement had been hardened and shielded, including a layer of copper mesh and lead sheeting in the outer walls that modern building codes had never required removing. Not much, old and imperfect, but it was attenuating his signal. It was a Faraday cage, partial degraded 60 years old, but a Faraday cage. He built a better one. It took 2 full days, working by flashlight with tools he knew as well as his own hands. Rebar, copper stripped from conduit, old cable shielding, wire mesh from the maintenance lockers. He grounded it to the building's buried foundation rods, 30 feet into bedrock, better than any surface ground, and lined the sleeping area with rubber matting torn from the sub-basement floor. When he finished, he sat inside the cage with his heart rate deliberately elevated from push-ups, and he watched through the grate as the orange shimmer swept past the building. It moved on. He let out a breath that had been waiting since the first evening. He slept in the cage after that. He moved through the building only when he had to, wearing rubber-soled boots, moving slow, keeping his heart rate down. He ate from the vending machine stock he'd hauled below on day 2, protein bars, crackers, instant soup he heated on a camp stove turned low enough that the flame was barely a blue whisper. He filled his thermos from the emergency water tanks on the second sub-basement level, filtered through his work shirt. He thought about his daughter, Maya, in Colorado, 23, studying environmental science. The last conversation they'd had been 4 days before the invasion, and he'd been distracted, half thinking about the HVAC job, and he hadn't said much. He thought about that conversation now the way you probe a sore tooth, deliberately, to see how bad it was. It was bad. He filed it under things he could fix later, which required believing there would be a later, which required keeping the 9 marks on the wall and adding to them. He was running low on reasons, and he was trying not to think about that when he found the child. It was the sound that got him. He'd been moving through the second sub-basement corridor on the 9th day, sliding along the wall with his hand on the conduit for guidance, the way he'd done every morning for a week. He knew every junction in this corridor now, knew the loose joint in the water pipe at the 40-foot mark, knew the smell of the tank room before he reached it. He was almost there when he heard it. Not a mechanical sound, not anything the building would make, but a tremor in the frequencies at the edge of hearing, the kind that lives below the threshold of identification and makes the roots of your back teeth ache. He stopped, he counted to 10, he breathed. It came again, a pulse, irregular, like a heartbeat that didn't know its own rhythm. He found her in the electrical room. She'd wedged herself behind the main breaker panel, in the narrow gap between the steel cabinet and the cinder block wall, and he almost didn't see her because she wasn't quite there in the way living things are supposed to be there. She flickered, like a fluorescent tube with a bad starter, that irregular, that involuntary. An outline of light that kept losing its shape and finding it again, suggesting proportions that were close to human but weren't, the head slightly too large, the limbs too long and too few, the whole form barely coherent at its edges, throwing faint discharge sparks that fizzled into nothing in the air around her. Orathi. He stayed in the doorway. His hand found the rubber handle of the insulated screwdriver in his belt, and he held it not as a weapon, because there was nothing he could do with a screwdriver against an Orathi, but as something to hold onto, the familiar weight of a tool he'd used 10,000 times. His heart was doing things he couldn't control. He breathed out through his nose deliberately, and in and out again, until his hands stopped doing what they were doing. He looked at her the way he looked at wiring diagrams, without emotion, just assessment. She was damaged. The flickering wasn't behavioral. He'd watched enough healthy Orathi by now to know their light had a confident coherence to it. This one was fragmented. Her outer field was compromised, sparking at the edges with the arrhythmia of a disrupted energy system. Something had hit her. He thought about the partially active lightning protection system on the ground floor. A grounded copper strike cable running down the east wall, something a healthy Orathi would navigate around instinctively, but that a smaller or less experienced one might not have known to account for. A discharge through an Orathi field would be like a power surge through unprotected electronics, catastrophic to the organizing principle, even if the source itself survived. She was alive, she was small, she was in pain. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He thought about 9 marks on a concrete wall, and about Maya in Colorado who he had to believe was fine, and about the woman with the dog who was ash in the street above him. Then he crossed the room and sat down on the floor 3 feet from the child, slowly, the way you approach anything frightened and hurting, and backed into a corner. No sudden movements, No direct eye contact held too long. He made himself smaller than the space required. He set his flashlight on the floor pointed away from her and put the screwdriver down. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice came out lower than usual, steadier than he expected. She flinched, her light contracted. The crackling at her edges intensified for a moment, discharged, settled. "Easy," he said. "Easy. I know you can't understand me. That's okay. I'm just going to sit here." He sat there. He didn't reach for her. He didn't angle toward her. He sat with his back against the opposite wall and his knees up and his hands in his lap. And after a while the crackling at her edges diminished slightly. And after a while longer she stopped making that sound, or stopped making it so loud, and Dex sat in the near silence and thought. He brought her a butane lantern the next morning. Not to see her better, though that was part of it, but because he'd noticed, watching the Orathi in the streets during the first days, that natural flame light seemed to register as neutral to them. Not electric light, which they consumed. Not sunlight through glass, which they navigated around. The specific orange-gold spectrum of combustion. They treated it as background, as environmental, as a property of the world rather than a signal to respond to. A world that burned things before they arrived. He set the lantern between them with the flame at its lowest setting, and the child's field steadied perceptibly. The crackling reduced. He wrote it down. He'd found a cheap spiral-bound notebook in the supply closet on day 6, and he'd been carrying it since, filling it with observations the way he'd filled work orders for 30 years. Because writing things down was how he processed what he saw, and because he had a feeling, not a plan yet, just a feeling in his hands, that what he was seeing might be worth recording for someone who came after. He couldn't feed her. He didn't know what she ate or if she ate in any way he could assist with, but he could do what he did, which was diagnose fault systems and then try to fix them. He studied her damage the way he studied a circuit with a problem, follow the symptom to the source. The disruption was concentrated in what he mentally labeled her upper left quadrant, a dense knot of disrupted field that she kept trying to reorganize and kept failing, which was costing resources she didn't have, like a computer trying to reboot from a corrupted drive. He sketched it in the notebook, annotated the sketch, wrote down the times the discharge sparks peaked and when they diminished. He spent 2 days on this before the solution came to him. It came the way solutions usually came, sideways, while he was doing something else. He was checking the grounding connection on his sleeping cage when the thought arrived. If it worked for him, why not for her? The Faraday principle wasn't about the biology inside. It was about establishing a stable electromagnetic boundary that the outside world couldn't read through, and that the inside system didn't have to work against. Her field was spending enormous energy maintaining its own coherence in open space, fighting the building's ambient electromagnetic environment, the ground currents, the residual charge in the copper strike cable, the naturally occurring noise floor of a mid-sized building's infrastructure. If he gave her a defined boundary to work within, a shielded enclosure with its own stable reference ground, she might be able to stop fighting the environment long enough to repair herself. Like a splint, you don't heal a broken thing. You hold it still long enough for it to start healing itself. He built the enclosure in one sustained session, working through the night. Smaller than his sleeping cage, just large enough for her to rest comfortably from the same materials. Stripped conduit copper, rubber sheeting, RF shielding foil from the building's broadcast equipment room. He grounded it to the same foundation rods. He tested it with his voltmeter, verified the attenuation was good, dragged the lantern inside at the flame height he'd noted and sat inside it for 10 minutes to warm the space. Then he opened the side panel and sat across the room and waited. She didn't move for a long time. He didn't push. He sat on the rubber mat with his notebook on his thigh and listened to her pulse the way he listened to an engine he was trying to diagnose. After a while he noticed something that went into the notebook. Her pulse changed subtly when his attention was actively on her versus when he was writing with his eyes down. Slightly faster, slightly more variable under direct attention. He labeled it provisionally, Presence Awareness Response, and added a question mark, because he was an engineer and he didn't assume what he couldn't verify. The child's field reached toward the enclosure, tentative, probing. Her sensing field extended into the space inside the copper mesh, read the electromagnetic environment, withdrew, extended again, read again. Then she moved. She flowed rather than walked. Orathi locomotion at low energy was a redistribution of field rather than bipedal motion, a quality he'd observed from the great and now saw close-up for the first time. And she came to the edge of the enclosure, and her field reached in, and she followed it. The moment she was fully inside, the crackling at her edges reduced. Not slowly, immediately, in the span of 3 seconds. Her outer field stopped throwing sparks. Her outline cohered. The organizing principle that had been fighting the open environment found the stable reference frame of the grounded enclosure and leaned into it the way a man with a bad leg leans into a good wall. Dex let out a slow breath. "Okay," he said quietly, "okay." He started sleeping in the electrical room. Not inside the enclosure, that was hers, but on his rubber mat near the door, close enough that his presence could register as consistent. He brought his camp stove and his thermos and his radio salvage project. He'd been pulling components from the building's emergency PA system for days, trying to build a receiver that might let him monitor the frequencies the Orathi used to coordinate their sweeps. Something to do with his hands that was also something useful. The child watched him work. That was what got to him, eventually. Not that she tolerated his presence that he'd expected, as a product of the enclosure and the lantern and the patience. What he hadn't expected was the quality of the attention. Her field oriented toward him when he moved, the way a dog's eyes track you around a room without the dog moving its head. When he made sounds, she noted them. When he held something up, she seemed to register it. And when he was absent from the room, which he tested deliberately, slipping out for 20 minutes and then returning, the quality of her field when he came back was different from when he'd left. Calmer, more organized. He started talking to her. Not performing anything. Just narrating, low and even, the way his father used to narrate his own work on Saturday afternoons in the garage when Dex was small. This capacitor goes here, and the reason I'm using a tantalum over a ceramic is functional, matter of fact, filling the silence with something human and steady. He told her his name. He told her about the HVAC system he'd been rerouting when the world changed, and why the work had annoyed him in the particular way that contract work in unfamiliar buildings always annoyed him, and how small that annoyance seemed now. He told her about Maya, about Colorado, about environmental science, about the last conversation that had been too short and too distracted, and how he was going to have a better one when he had the chance. He told her about the soup, which was terrible, and held up the little cup so she could see it. "I would not recommend this to anyone," he said. "I want that on the record, in case the record matters." Her field pulsed, once distinctly different from the distress pulse he'd learned to recognize. Slower, steadier. A different quality, not the arrhythmic stutter of pain, but something measured, something that seemed almost deliberate. He wrote it down, labeled it non-distress pulse during conversation, vocal response, added a question mark, then below it after a pause added humor. He wrote everything, the precise times of her pulses and what he'd been doing when they happened, the arc of her recovery, still slow, still incomplete but measurably improving, day by day. The way discharge sparks had reduced by roughly 40% between day 1 and day 5, which he sketched as a rough graph on the back of the notebook's cover. The flame heights he'd tested, and their effects on her field coherence. The behavioral observations, careful and specific, the kind of notes he'd take on a system he was being paid to understand. On the 11th day, at 2 in the morning, lying on his mat unable to sleep, he noticed something that went into the notebook with 3 exclamation marks and an underline. The pulse frequency was consistently different when he was present in the room versus when he'd been absent. Not marginally, measurably. He'd been so focused on tracking her damage that he hadn't seen it as a pattern until now. He lay in the dark for a while after he wrote it down. "Huh," he said quietly. Her field pulsed, slow, steady, non-distress. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He turned off his flashlight and listened to the city's new silence, and thought about what it meant that something completely alien to him was doing something that looked, from the outside, exactly like noting his presence. On the 14th day, the Queen came. He felt it before he saw it, a pressure change in the building, the way the air before a serious storm takes on a different quality. It came over him while he was bent over the radio project, a crawling across his skin, the hairs on his forearms rising. He looked up. He looked at the child. Her field blazed up. Brilliant and sudden and fully coherent for the first time since he'd found her. Every damaged edge sealed and incandescent, organized in a way it hadn't been for 2 weeks. The recovery he'd been watching day by day, the slow return of structure to her field, she'd been doing that steadily, but this was something different. This wasn't recovery. This was recognition. She'd been broadcasting. Of course she had. He'd been recording distress pulses and labeling them as symptoms without thinking about what they were on her own bandwidth, without thinking about the fact that he was writing down calls for help and filing them as data points. Every pulse he documented was a signal going out. Weak and disrupted, yes, but continuous, because that's what distress does. And something had finally come close enough to hear. He had 30 seconds, maybe less. He thought about the maintenance tunnel. He'd scouted it on day 4. 120 feet of concrete corridor connecting to the adjacent parking structure, a steel door with a manual release, then the car ramp to the street. If he went now, low signal, rubber soles, heart rate down, he could clear the building before the sweep hit him. He looked at the child. She was blazing, her field oriented toward him, not toward the ceiling, not outward, not in the direction the Queen was coming from, toward him. And he knew that field. He had 14 days of notation on it. He knew what it looked like when she was in distress, and what it looked like when she was resting, and what it looked like at 2 in the morning when he was the only thing in the room. This was none of those. He thought about Maya in Colorado, and sent her a message through whatever medium worked for things you couldn't say out loud. Then he sat down on the floor. He put the notebook in his breast pocket. He put his hands in his lap. He breathed out and in and out, and kept his heart rate down, because whatever came through the ceiling in the next 30 seconds was going to read his bioelectric signature as its first line of information about him, and the first thing he wanted it to read was calm. He was not precisely calm. He was as close to it as 30 years of working around live current had made him capable of being when it counted. The maintenance tunnel was still an option. He ran the math one more time, the way he'd run it 50 times in the last 30 seconds. 120 feet to the parking structure. Steel door, manual release, quarter-turn counterclockwise. He'd oiled it on day 4. Then the car ramp, then the street. If the Queen's sweep was coming from above and moving down, he had a chance of being below and lateral and gone before her sensing field hit the sub-basement level. He looked at the child again. She wasn't calling to him. She wasn't broadcasting distress. She was blazing with the specific quality of a creature that had heard something it had been waiting for, and her field had organized itself in the direction of what was coming, not in the direction of the man sitting on the floor across from her. But he turned but over in his hands the way he turned a component he wasn't sure about, trying to read it from every angle. She'd known he was in the room consistently for 14 days. The field behavior documented in his notebook demonstrated it, the presence-awareness response, the pulse frequency difference, the specific quality of the non-distress pulses that happened during conversation versus in silence. She had been noting him. Whatever that meant in Orathi terms, whatever the functional equivalent of asterisk noting, was for a being whose entire sensory experience was electromagnetic. She had been doing it. She had been aware of him, specifically, as a consistent presence, as distinct from the building's ambient field and from the standard noise floor of human bioelectric signature. She knew he was here. The Queen would know he was here too, the moment she read her daughter's recent field history, which Dex understood was the kind of information that got recorded in some way, the same way a human remembered where they'd been. If he ran, he would be recorded as having run. If he sat here, he would be recorded as having stayed. He didn't think he had enough information to know which of those was safer in the long term. He didn't think he had enough information to make a rational decision at all. He thought, I have been making decisions with insufficient information for 14 days, and I am still here. He sat on the floor and put his hands in his lap and breathed out slowly, and the crawling across his skin intensified, and the pressure in the building shifted, and the Queen came through the ceiling. The Queen came through the ceiling. There wasn't another way to describe it. The Orathi at full power didn't interact with architectural barriers in any way that mattered. She passed through the building's infrastructure the way a radio signal passes through walls, and she materialized in the electrical room with a presence so immense that Dex felt it physically before he saw it. The air pressure changed. His eardrums adjusted. A warmth arrived that came from everywhere simultaneously. She filled the room's upper half and pressed against its dimensions, her light so brilliant he couldn't look at the center of her, only at the edge, the border region where she met the air and was defined against the world. And there was depth to her, a quality of depth that unsettled him in a way no amount of grounding exercises could suppress. The sense that what was visible in this room was a fraction of what existed, an iceberg quality, a weather system quality, a scale of thing that his nervous system was not designed to stand in the presence of without every alarm it possessed firing at once. He sat still and kept his heart rate down. Her sensing field hit him like a current passed through water. He felt his nervous system map itself, every bioelectric process suddenly visible to something else's attention, his heart rate and his brainwave pattern and the electrical activity in every muscle group and the charge differential across every cell membrane, all of it read simultaneously and completely, like a diagnostic sweep of a system that had never been opened before. It wasn't painful. It was thorough. He sat still and let it be thorough and looked at the edge of her where he could look without the brightness becoming impossible. The child moved. She flowed across the room to the Queen, brilliant, organized, fully recovered, nothing like the damaged flickering thing he'd found behind the breaker panel. And there was a rapid exchange between them that Dex couldn't follow, fields interpenetrating and responding, a conversation happening in electromagnetic frequencies below his ability to decode. He watched its quality the way he watched a conversation in a language he didn't know. He couldn't get the words, but he could read the register. Not alarm. Not crisis. The field behaviors were too fast and too dense for him to parse precisely, but they didn't have the signature he associated with emergency in the 14 days of field behavior he documented. Then the Queen turned her attention back to him. He held still. He reached slowly into his breast pocket, slowly, making every motion visible, the way you move around anything capable of killing you if it misread your intention, and he pulled out the notebook. He opened it to the first page. He held it up. It was filled front to back, 14 days of observation in his cramped engineer's handwriting. The distress pulse frequencies, annotated with precise times. The damage profile sketched across 3 pages with a rough graph of its reduction over time. The enclosure design dimensioned and grounded with a note on which foundation rods he'd used. The lantern flame heights tested and their effects on field coherence cataloged. The behavioral observations, the presence awareness response, the non-distress pulses during conversation, the consistency of the difference between his absence and his presence readings. the waveform sketch on page 11 that he thought might be her individual signature, the 2 a.m. observation on day 11, underlined and annotated with 3 exclamation marks. The last entry, written the previous evening after she'd slept through without a single discharge spark. She slept through. Field steady. I think she's going to be okay. No leverage in that last line. No claim. No transaction. He looked at the edge of the Queen's light and said, I kept records, in case they helped someone later, in case someone needed to know what worked. He said it because it was true. He didn't say it for effect. The pressure in the room shifted. The Queen's field moved toward him, slow and deliberate and immense, the movement of something that didn't hurry because it didn't have to, and Dex held himself very still. This was the moment, and he had sat down on the floor instead of running, and whatever happened now was what he'd chosen to be present for. Her field touched the notebook. Not him. The notebook, open in his hands, and she read it the way he'd observed the Orathi reading things. Completely, instantly, the entire content absorbed in the span of a single breath. He felt the quality of her attention move through it, the way he could feel his voltmeter touching a circuit, the sense of something being read at a depth and completeness that his handwriting had never been designed to withstand. She stilled. The child was watching him. Her field was blazing, steady, incandescent. The Queen withdrew her field from the notebook. She turned it back to Dex. The quality of the attention was different now. Not assessment, not threat evaluation, not the diagnostic thoroughness of that first sensing sweep. Something else, something that lived in the same general territory as the feeling you have when you've been trusted with something fragile and you have not broken it, and the person who trusted you can see that you didn't, and something passes between you that doesn't need words. Her field touched his hand. Not a sweep, not a scan, a placement, deliberate, weighted, her field against the back of his hand the way someone places their own hand over yours when language isn't adequate to what they want to say. He felt it as warmth. They stayed in the electrical room for most of that day. He showed her the enclosure. Explained what he'd been trying to do, pointing at the copper mesh and tracing the grounding wire to the floor, using his hands and his voice and the notebook sketches as a kind of rough translation. I didn't know if it would work, he said. I don't know your biology. I know electricity. That's what I had. That's what I used. The Queen's field moved through the enclosure, reading it, and Dex had the clear sense that his explanation was entirely redundant to her. She was an energy being reading the work of someone who spent his life working with energy, and the vocabulary was different but the logic wasn't, and she had understood it in the same moment she'd read the notebook. He didn't mind. He kept talking anyway. He told her about the Faraday principle in the way he'd explained it to every apprentice he'd ever worked with, starting from the basic idea, building it up in pieces, the way you build a circuit from components, one thing leading to the next. The principle is that a conductive shell redistributes charge on its outer surface, which means the inside of the shell is shielded from external fields. Michael Faraday demonstrated it in 1836 with an ice pail and an electroscope. I demonstrated it in a sub-basement with stolen copper and rubber matting. He paused. I think about him sometimes. Faraday, he was a bookbinder's apprentice. He taught himself physics. He figured out electromagnetic induction by doing things and watching what happened, not by having the mathematics first. The Queen's field moved in that measuring, reading way. I think you'd have liked him, Dex said. He was good at looking at things. He showed her the radio salvage project, the partially assembled receiver on the concrete floor, the components he'd extracted from the PA system, the hand-drawn circuit diagram in the back of the first notebook. I was trying to listen, he said, to what you use for coordination. I figured if I knew when the sweeps were coming I could warn other survivors. I never got it working properly. The oscillator is wrong. I needed something with a lower frequency range than what I had access to. He looked at the circuit diagram for a moment. "I was going to try recalibrating it today, actually, before you arrived." The Queen's field touched the circuit diagram the way it had touched the notebook, reading it, completely and instantly, and then it moved to the assembled receiver components on the floor. Dex watched her attention move through the circuit with the same focused quality she'd brought to the enclosure, reading the logic, understanding the goal. She did something he couldn't follow with his eyes, a precise movement of her field at a scale he couldn't resolve, and the receiver on the floor emitted a sound. A single clear tone, in a frequency range well below what he'd been targeting. He stared at it. He picked up the voltmeter and tested the circuit connections. Nothing had changed in the physical components. The wiring was exactly as he'd left it. But the receiver was outputting a signal it hadn't been capable of generating with its current components, which meant she'd done something at a level below his ability to observe, at the level of field interaction with the individual components rather than with the circuit as a whole. He sat back and looked at the receiver for a moment. "That's a frequency I can work with," he said. "That's actually, thank you, that's useful." He wrote it down. Date, time, description of what had happened, measured output frequency, note about the mechanism being opaque to him but the result being clear. Then he added, "She understood what I was trying to do and made it work better. Check your assumptions about who is teaching whom." The child was inside the enclosure, her field fully recovered, watching both of them with the orientation he'd come to know as attention. "Her name," he said, "does she have one? I know you can't tell me in a way I'll understand." He turned to the page where he'd sketched what he thought was her individual signal, the waveform he'd identified on day 3, the pulse that was distinct from the Queen's and distinct from the ambient field noise of the Orathi coordination sweeps, the one he thought of as specifically her. "I wrote this down. I thought it might be her signature specifically, distinct from everything else." The child's field pulsed, once clearly at that frequency, the one he'd been noting since the beginning, the one that was hers. He turned to a new page in the notebook and wrote, "Day 14. She confirmed the signature as hers, distinct, individual." He labeled the waveform sketch on the previous page with one word, hers. "Okay," he said. "Okay." The Queen's field moved over the sketch. She read it for a long moment, longer than the instantaneous read she'd done on the full notebook, and Dex thought that might mean something, that she was choosing to spend time on it rather than just taking the information. He wrote that down too. They stayed until the light from the ceiling grates had shifted from afternoon gray to the blue-black of early evening, and in that time, Dex talked and wrote and showed and explained, and the Queen listened in the way that enormous, ancient intelligences listen when they've decided to, which is completely, without distraction, with the quality of attention that makes you understand for the first time how rarely you've been truly listened to. Before she left, her field moved to him one more time. It didn't touch his hand this time. It moved to his chest, to the breast pocket where the notebook lived, and rested there for a moment, specific and deliberate. He understood that. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I'll keep writing." He found the other survivors on his second day above ground. 11 people in the basement of a community church 6 blocks east, reached through the maintenance tunnel and the parking structure, and a long, careful walk through a city he now knew how to read. He came in through the basement window, slowly, hands visible, and the woman who met him with a fire extinguisher raised like a club looked at him, the way people look at someone who has walked out of a nightmare already wearing the next day's expression. Her name was Carla. She put the extinguisher down. Behind her, 10 other people watched, 2 kids, an older man with a cane, a young woman with a broken arm in a makeshift sling, the rest a spread of ages and histories that had been made irrelevant by the last 2 weeks. "How are you alive?" Carla said, not hostile, genuinely curious. "Electrician," Dex said. "It helps. Does anyone have a ham radio that can be hardwired to a generator? He told them what he knew. All of it in the order he'd figured it out. The bioelectric signature, the insulation principle, the Faraday approach scaled to whatever space they were sheltering in. The flame heights that registered as neutral versus the electrical light the Orathi consumed. The behavioral signatures he'd learned to distinguish, hunting sweep, resting field, active engagement, and what they looked like from a distance, and what they meant about whether you had time to move. He told them about the child, and about the queen, and about the notebook, and he told it plainly without drama, because what had happened was strange enough without him making it stranger. Some of them looked at him like he was broken. Some of them understood immediately. Carla understood immediately. She'd leaned forward while he talked, elbows on her knees, taking mental notes the way he took written ones, and when he finished she held out her hand and said, "Can I see it?" He gave her the notebook. She read it carefully, all of it, every page in the camp lantern light with 11 people around her, and when she finished, she looked up with the focused expression of someone who has found something she didn't know she was looking for. "The queen is going to come back," she said. "Yes. And you need to be ready to keep translating when she does. That's the plan." He reached into his bag and pulled out the second notebook, the one he'd started when the first ran out of pages, the one he'd been writing in since he came above ground. "I've got a structure. It won't be fast, it won't be clean, but it's a starting point." Carla was quiet for a moment. Then, "I coordinated curricula for 14 schools before. I know how to build from a starting point." "Good," he said, "very good." She started pulling the ham radio gear toward the generator before he'd even sat down. He watched her work with the appreciation of a man who'd spent his career distinguishing between people who understood systems and people who just operated them. Carla understood systems. She'd asked 3 specific questions while he was explaining the Faraday principle, about the attenuation characteristics of different materials, about why rubber specifically, about the grounding depth he'd achieved with the foundation rods. And her questions were the right questions, the kind that came from someone who was building an internal model rather than just collecting instructions. "The kids," he said, nodding toward the 2 children in the corner, the 12-year-old with the bandaged forehead and a smaller boy, maybe 8, who was watching the adults with the careful attention of a child who has learned that watching carefully is how you understand what's going to happen next. They need to understand this too, the insulation principle especially. It's the most important survival skill I've worked out. "They'll understand it," Carla said. She wasn't looking up from the generator's connection panel, her fingers moving with the confident efficiency of someone who'd assembled and disassembled this kind of equipment before. "Sarah's already been asking questions since you started talking. The boy, his name is Tamaz. He stopped asking questions after the first week, but he watches everything. He's building a model. He just doesn't put it into words yet." Dex looked at the boy. Tamaz was looking back at him, level and serious, with the expression of someone much older inhabiting a face that hadn't finished growing into it. "Smart kid," Dex said. "They both are." Carla made a connection and the generator coughed to life, low and diesel quiet, and she nodded with satisfaction. "What happened in the electrical room?" she said without looking up. "When you sat down instead of running, you want to tell me what that actually was, because I read your notebook and I can see what you were thinking, but I want to know what it felt like." Dex was quiet for a moment. "It felt like diagnosis," he said finally. "The way it feels when you're in front of a system and you're still gathering information. You don't act yet because you don't know enough yet, and you don't know enough yet because you haven't looked long enough. So you stay. You look longer." Carla was quiet, doing something precise with the radio connections. "And then," she said, "and then the information starts coming in, and you adjust." She looked up at him then briefly with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she nodded and went back to the connections. I want the others to hear you explain it that way, she said. Not the science. That part, the diagnosis part. He hadn't thought of it that way before. But she was right that there was something in it worth passing on, and the radio crackled to life with a static hiss that sounded, in the church basement, like the first word of a language they were only beginning to learn. Outside, the city's new silence held. Inside, 11 people leaned toward the radio, and Dex opened the second notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, and underneath it wrote, "What we know, what we don't know, what we're going to find out." He drew a line under it. Then he started. The Queen came back on the third day, alone, and she came through the door. He noted it before anything else, and he noted it quickly, because it was the kind of detail that mattered. Not through the ceiling, not through the wall. Through the door that Carla had left unlocked because Dex had asked her to, because he'd thought, without being able to fully articulate why. Just the feeling in his hands that said pay attention to this, that it might matter if there was a door she could use. She used it. The 11 people in the community church basement were quiet when she arrived. One of the children, a girl of about 12 with a bandaged forehead and the focused expression of a kid who decided that what was happening was interesting rather than only terrifying, pressed forward instead of back, and the Queen's field swept her lightly. Reading, not hunting. The distinction was everything, and the girl seemed to feel it too, her eyes going wide not with fear but with the specific wonder of having been noticed by something vast. The Queen's field moved to Dex. He stood in the center of the room with the notebooks, both of them, and Carla beside him with her hand on his arm, not gripping, just present. He felt the translation beginning. It was rough. It was imprecise. It was two intelligences from completely different evolutionary histories, trying to find the seams where their experiences overlapped enough to pass meaning through. He wrote what she showed him about the Orathi field communication structure. Not words, not syntax as humans used it, but modulation patterns that corresponded to categories of meaning, that he could index and cross-reference and slowly build a working vocabulary from. He wrote what she showed him about why the child had been in the building, which was not a story about an accident but a story about an Orathi child who had been curious about the specific electromagnetic architecture of a human building, who had read it from a distance and wanted to understand how it worked, who had come too close to the grounded strike cable because she was attending to something else, which was the oldest story in the world about children and interesting things and not watching where you were going. He wrote that down and labeled it curiosity, recognizable across, and then stopped and wrote species, with a question mark, and then wrote yes without one. He wrote what she showed him about the Orathi on Earth. Not their numbers, not their positions. She wasn't giving him tactical intelligence and he hadn't asked for it, because that wasn't what this was and both of them understood that. But context, the nature of what Earth was in their framework of understanding. The sense she gave him of what it had meant when her daughter's damaged signal had finally reached her. What had been in it, what the signature of a creature being kept warm and safe and steady in an unfamiliar environment looked like to an Orathi reading it across distance. What had come through was not a signal that said, "Help me, I'm trapped." It was a signal that said, "I am being cared for." He sat with that for a long time after he wrote it down. It told him something about the Orathi that he hadn't known how to ask for, that the distinction between asterisk held captive and asterisk cared for asterisk was legible to them, that those two states had different electromagnetic signatures, different qualities of field output, different things they did to a creature's bioelectric profile, and that an Orathi reading that profile from a distance could tell the difference, which meant the difference was real, which meant that whatever he'd been doing in the electrical room, the enclosure, the lantern, the talking, the notes, the patience, had registered not as captivity but as its opposite. He thought about that. Then he thought about all the other humans out there, in all the other buildings in all the other cities, trying to survive by going quiet and going dark and going still, hiding their bioelectric signatures behind whatever insulation they could find, which was good and necessary and kept them alive. But it also meant they were broadcasting, faintly, underneath the insulation, the specific electromagnetic signature of fear and isolation and diminishment, which was what a creature in captivity broadcast, and which was what any Orathi within range was reading. He thought about what it would mean to broadcast something different. He didn't know yet what different would look like at scale. He didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, didn't have enough of the translation built. But he wrote it down as a hypothesis, the way you write down a hypothesis before you know how to test it. What if the way to be left alone isn't to go smaller? What if the signal to send is stable, organized, not afraid, not absence of signal, but the right signal? He put a question mark at the end and looked at the Queen. Her field moved over the page. She read it. Something in the quality of her attention changed. He didn't know what that meant yet. He was 14 days into a vocabulary that would take years to build. But he wrote down what he observed. Field quality changed when reading this hypothesis, distinguishable from standard reading response, character unclear, and he drew a line under it, and he turned to the next page. Outside, somewhere in the city, an orange shimmer moved through a street he couldn't see. He heard one of the 11 shift behind him. "Keep still," he said quietly. "Keep your heart rate down, it's not here for us." He turned to the next page. There is a particular kind of human stubbornness that has nothing to do with aggression. It isn't the kind that picks fights, or builds weapons, or names itself after victories. It's quieter than that, and older, and runs deeper than courage because it doesn't require the adrenaline that makes courage possible. It's the stubbornness of the man who sits down on the floor instead of running, because he's looked at something frightened and hurting, and understood that running is not the right answer here. It lives in 14 marks scratched into concrete, in copper mesh and rubber matting assembled in a dark room by flashlight, in a cheap spiral notebook filled front to back with waveform sketches and flame height observations, and a note about soup made at 2 in the morning in a sub-basement that smelled like rust and old concrete. The Orathi had come to Earth because Earth had something they needed, and they had taken it the way civilizations take things, with force and without asking. That was not a small thing, and it would never be a small thing, and Dex Calloway was a man who worked with facts, and he did not pretend otherwise. 11 people in a church basement, ash in the streets, the woman with the dog who was not there anymore. Those things were true, and would stay true, and no amount of what had happened in the electrical room of the Harwick Civic Center changed them. But something had happened in that room. Something nobody had planned for, nobody had calculated for in whatever Orathi mathematics governed an invasion. Nobody had written into any human emergency management protocol, because it was too specific and too strange and too particular to plan. A man who knew electricity had looked at a non-human child and seen the symptoms of a fault in a system he could help with, and he had helped with it, because that was what you did when you could. When a thing was broken and you had the tools and the knowledge and the time, you fixed it. That was the whole principle. That was the only principle. The Queen had come to the sub-basement of the Harwick Civic Center expecting to find her daughter used as leverage, or dead, or preserved as a specimen, or simply surviving in spite of whatever human survival logic had prevailed in that room. She had found her inside a Faraday enclosure built by hand from conduit wire and RF shielding foil, beside a lantern at a specific flame height that had taken 3 days of testing to identify as the right one, with a notebook lying open on the floor outside the enclosure documenting everything that had worked and everything that hadn't, meticulous and unembellished, ending with a line written the night before without any claim attached to it, without any leverage implied in it, without any transaction suggested by it. She slept through. "Field steady. I think she's going to be okay." The Queen had read it in a single moment and understood it entirely. Not the words, the intent behind the words, which lived in the electromagnetic substrate of everything he'd built and noted and observed, in the specific quality of care that organizes itself as documentation, as record, as the impulse to write things down so that someone who comes after will know what worked. She had been to 100 worlds. She had read 1,000 species. She knew the mathematics of survival and the grammar of war, and every formulation of asterisk us and them, that living things had ever used to make the terrible things necessary. She had never read a notebook like that before. She had placed her field against his hand, and he had felt it as warmth, and she had come back through the door on the 3rd day above ground, and the translation had begun. It was slow. It was imprecise. It would take longer than any one person had, longer than Dex Calloway's contribution to it, longer than the 11 people in the community church basement and the radio they'd hardwired to a generator, and the signals they were beginning to send out into whatever frequencies the surviving world was listening on. There were other survivors. They'd confirmed that much in the first day above ground. Voices coming back through the ham radio at frequencies he'd never have found without the receiver the Queen had corrected. There were people in the eastern districts in the River Valley, in the university complex 6 miles north. There were people doing what humans do when they have to, holding on, adapting, figuring it out as they went, writing things down. He was going to find all of them. He was going to get the notebooks to them. He was going to build something from the starting point, the way you build any complex system, one connection at a time, tested and verified, no shortcuts that skip the verification step. He was not going to stop counting the days. On the wall of the electrical room in the sub-basement of the Harwick Civic Center, a room that had held one damaged Orathi child and one stubborn electrician, and 2 weeks of something neither of them had planned, there were 16 scratch marks in the concrete. He'd stopped adding to them when he came above ground, but he hadn't stopped counting. He carried the count with him the way he carried his tool bag, as part of the equipment required for the work. Day 1, Day 2, all the way to now and forward from now into whatever the world was becoming. The Queen came back because she'd read something in a notebook that no amount of force and no amount of calculation had prepared her for. The record of care given without transaction, without leverage, without anything expected in return. That was the thing she couldn't have calculated for, because it wasn't a tactic. It wasn't survival logic dressed up as kindness. It was just a man in the dark who found something hurting and did what he could with what he had. You couldn't plan for that. You couldn't predict it, couldn't account for it in any mathematics of invasion or resistance. It was specifically, stubbornly, exhaustingly human. And it had been happening in the dark of basements and sub-basements all over the city and all over the world for 16 days, unrecorded and unobserved, small acts of care carried out by frightened people in the dark, because that was what frightened people did when they were also, fundamentally, good. He was going to write all of it down. Every piece, every signal, everything that worked and everything that didn't. The waveform that was the child's name. The flame height that registered as neutral, the precise quality of attention that meant the Queen was reading rather than hunting, the hypothesis about signal versus absence of signal, about what it meant to broadcast asterisk stable instead of asterisk small asterisk. He was going to write it all down in the cramped handwriting of a man who'd learned to think with his hands, and Carla was going to index it with the organized precision of a woman who'd built curricula for 14 schools. And it was going to get to people who needed it, and those people were going to add to it. And someday, not soon, not easily, not without cost, it was going to be enough to build something from. But it had begun. In 2 cheap spiral notebooks, in a copper mesh enclosure, in the specific quality of warmth a Queen's field communicated when she read a last entry that said only, "I think she's going to be okay." He turned to the next page. He wrote the date at the top, and the time, and then he looked up at the Queen, her light filling the space above him, patient and immense, and oriented toward him with the quality of attention he'd been reading for 16 days and was only beginning to understand. "Okay," he said, "show me the next part." He started to write.